The morning after a hard rain, Earl Dunmore walked into the barn to check on feed sacks he'd left near the far wall and stopped 2 steps past the door. Green shoots, thin as sewing thread, pushed up through the seam between 2 floorboards near the center of the barn. He figured at first that a few kernels had spilled from a torn sack sometime that spring and taken root in a crack where dust and moisture had gathered. He knelt down to pull them loose. But when he got close enough to look properly, the shoots weren't rising out of anything sitting on top of the floor. They were coming up through it, out of the seam itself, from somewhere underneath the boards. Earl sat back on his heels and stared at that seam for a long time before he ever reached for a pry bar. Earl Dunmore was in his late 40s that summer of 1987, running a modest corn and cattle operation on ground his father had worked before him, in a stretch of Missouri where the bank had grown less patient every season the yields kept slipping. He lived on the place with his wife and 2 kids, and he'd only just taken the farm over full-time the year before, after his father's health made the decision for both of them. The transition hadn't been an easy one. Earl's father had run the place a certain way for 40 years, and plenty of the neighbors still measured Earl against that standard, whether he asked them to or not. Yields had dropped 2 years running before Earl ever took the reins, and the 3rd year, his first full season in charge, hadn't done much to reverse the trend. He'd refinanced once already to cover a bad stretch of weather, and the loan officer in town had made it plain, without quite saying so outright, that there wasn't much room left to refinance again if this year came up short too. The barn at the center of it all was pushing 70 years old, and it looked every bit of it. The roof had gone gray and sway-backed in the middle. The siding had silvered with age, warped in places where nails had long since given up their grip. A section of the floor near the middle had swollen and buckled, the boards gone soft enough in spots that Earl avoided walking there with anything heavier than a feed bucket. Rats had gotten into the corn he'd stored there the past 2 winters running, and the current storage space was too small for what the farm actually needed to hold on to through a bad year. A neighbor who'd stopped by that spring to look over a fence line had glanced at the barn and delivered his verdict without much ceremony. "That barn's finished," he said. Another told Earl flat out that tearing it down would cost him less in the long run than trying to save it. A third, half joking, told him he'd get more use out of the lumber sold for scrap than he ever would trying to patch a floor that old. Earl hadn't argued with any of them. Looking at the place from the yard, he couldn't have argued much even if he'd wanted to. He'd already priced out a new pole barn to replace it. A few $1,000s he didn't especially have, but figured he'd have to find anyway before winter. Then he found corn growing up through his own barn floor on a morning when nothing about the weather explained it, and the barn stopped looking quite so simple. He worked a pry bar under the nearest board and lifted it clear, then a second, then a third. What sat beneath wasn't the packed earth floor he expected to find under an old barn like this one. It was open space, dark and cool, running further than the light from the doorway could reach. He fetched an old oil lamp from the tack room and held it down into the gap. The light caught the edge of something built, not dug. Stone and timber worked together in a way that hadn't happened by accident. He picked up a length of scrapboard and let it drop into the opening, just to gauge the depth. It fell farther than he expected before he heard it land. Earl didn't try to explain it to himself yet. He pulled up 3 or 4 more boards instead, working carefully, widening the gap until he could see the shape of what he'd uncovered. Underneath the barn floor ran a series of compartments built from stacked stone at the base, timber framing above it, and packed earth walls between each section, with narrow wooden dividers separating one compartment from the next. In one corner, half buried under years of dust and dry rot, he found old corn kernels, dried hard as pebbles but still whole, still recognizably corn. He picked one up and turned it over in his hand. Then he found another, then a dozen more, then what looked like hundreds, packed in layers rather than scattered loose the way spilled grain would settle. Grain didn't fall into neat layers on its own. Somebody had put it there on purpose and taken care doing it. Earl spent the rest of that day going through what was left of the old barn's original fittings, trying to remember anything his father had ever said about it. What came back to him was a single line, offered years earlier without much context at the time. "Your grandfather never wasted a good board," his father had told him once, working on a fence post that had nothing obviously to do with the barn at all. Behind a support beam in the loft, wedged into a gap Earl had walked past 100 times without noticing, he found an old tin box. Inside were a few faded receipts, some photographs gone soft and curling at the edges, a rough hand-drawn plan of the barn, and a ledger bound in cracked leather. That was the moment the question in Earl's mind shifted. He'd started the day asking what was underneath his floor. By evening, sitting on an overturned bucket with the tin box open on his knee, he was asking why somebody had built it there in the first place. The hand-drawn plan answered part of that on its own. The barn floor, Earl realized studying it, sat higher off the ground than a barn its size had any obvious reason to. Underneath ran the compartment system he'd already found, laid out deliberately across the plan in a grid of separate cells rather than one open space. It wasn't built as a single large pit the way Earl had first assumed. It was a series of smaller chambers, each one sealed off from the next, built to keep corn away from rats, to hold a steady temperature through the seasons, to manage moisture, and to let air move through the grain slowly enough to keep it from spoiling over long storage. And because the chambers were separated rather than open to one another, a problem in one section, a leak, a rat that found its way in, damp that crept up from below, stayed contained. The rest of the grain stayed safe, regardless of what happened in any single cell. It was a detail that turned the discovery from something that merely looked old into something that had clearly been built with real thought behind it, a working system rather than a hiding place. Earl spent the better part of an hour just tracing the layout with the lamp, counting the compartments, 6 of them by his count, each roughly 3 feet square, separated by timber dividers packed tight with earth to keep air and moisture from moving freely between one cell and the next. Small gaps had been left near the top of each dividing wall, just wide enough to let air circulate slowly without letting grain or vermin pass through, a detail Earl wouldn't have thought to build himself but recognized immediately as clever once he saw it. Earl might have stopped there, satisfied to understand what he'd found and move on to deciding what to do with it. But the ledger held more than he expected. Reading through it that evening by lamplight, he found records going back decades, tracking corn stored, corn drawn out, dates and amounts in his grandfather's careful hand. Most years, the entries were routine, corn going in after harvest, corn coming out through the winter and into spring planting. But one stretch of pages, dated to a severe drought years before Earl was born, told a different story. The farm had lost nearly its entire crop that year, the ledger made plain, the fields burned dry through most of the growing season. And yet the family had corn to eat that winter, and seed corn enough to plant again the following spring. The reason sat right there in his grandfather's handwriting. He had held back a portion of grain and seed in the compartments under the barn floor before the drought ever hit, the way he apparently had most years, treating the space as insurance rather than overflow storage. What stopped Earl cold wasn't that part. It was the line beneath it. His grandfather hadn't only fed his own family from that hidden reserve that year. He'd written down the names of neighboring families who'd come by during the worst of it and left with corn of their own. The same plain accounting Earl had seen in stories about other old farms in that part of the county, quantities noted without a single price attached anywhere on the page. Earl recognized 2 of the names right away, families still farming not far down the road, grandchildren of the same people his grandfather had once quietly helped through a year that should have broken them. He sat with that for a while, the lamp burning low beside him, thinking about how many times he'd shaken hands with those men at the feed store or the sale barn, without either of them knowing what their families owed to a barn floor, neither had ever thought twice about. The barn wasn't just a clever piece of engineering. It had been part of how the whole community got through a year that could have broken more than one family on that ridge. Earl didn't tear the barn down after that. He spent the rest of that summer restoring it instead, replacing the rotten boards on top with sound lumber, repairing the compartment walls below where age and moisture had worn them thin, clearing out the old dried corn that had sat there since before he was born, and setting a portion of that year's fresh harvest into the same chambers his grandfather had built, following the same pattern the old hand-drawn plan had laid out. He worked most evenings after the regular chores were done, carrying lumber down into the compartments one board at a time, careful not to disturb more of the old structure than he had to. He replaced 2 of the timber dividers that had rotted through completely, using the same rough-cut style his grandfather had used rather than anything milled smooth, figuring the old design had earned the right to stay consistent with itself. He cleared the small air gaps near the top of each wall where decades of dust had packed them shut, and rebuilt the section of floor above with boards thick enough to bear a man's weight without the give that had worried him for 2 years running. Neighbors who'd told him to tear the place down came by that fall to see what he'd done, mostly out of curiosity, some of them still doubtful it had been worth the trouble. That same fall brought trouble of its own. Damp weather set in early, and rats got into more than one farm's grain storage up and down that stretch of county road, Earl's own newer bins included. He lost a portion of what he'd stored the ordinary way, same as several of his neighbors did. The new steel bin he'd bought 2 years earlier, the one he'd trusted more than the old barn, turned out to be exactly as vulnerable as anything else that fall. A seam near the base let moisture creep in during a stretch of heavy rain, and by the time Earl caught it, close to a fifth of what he'd stored there had gone soft and moldy, not worth feeding to hogs, let alone selling. 2 farms further down the road lost more than that to rats that had worked their way into storage. Nobody had thought to check as often as they should have. But the corn he'd set into the old compartments under the barn floor came through clean, dry, and untouched, exactly the way his grandfather's system had been built to keep it. Earl pulled a sample from each of the 6 chambers that December, checking for the same soft spots and mold he'd found in the steel bin, and found nothing but sound, dry grain in every one of them. The narrow air gaps his grandfather had built into the dividing walls had done exactly what they were meant to do, letting just enough air move through to keep the moisture from ever settling. The same man who'd once told Earl to tear the barn down came around that winter, looking a little sheepish, and asked him plainly how he'd managed to keep his grain in a year when so many others hadn't. Earl didn't have much of a speech ready for him. He just looked down at the barn floor, at the boards he'd replaced over what still sat safely underneath, and let the man draw his own conclusions. Word got around the way it does in a small county, and by early spring, Earl had 2 more neighbors asking to come look at what he'd built, wondering aloud whether something similar might be worth trying on their own places. Earl walked them through it, the same way his grandfather's plan had walked him through it, pointing out the compartments, the air gaps, the reason for keeping the grain divided rather than open in one large space. He didn't charge anybody for the time and didn't offer to build it for them either. He figured a thing like that worked better learned firsthand than handed over secondhand. He didn't try to put a dollar figure on what he'd found, and he didn't dress the story up as buried treasure, because it never had been that. What Earl kept coming back to, working through that barn all summer and fall, was something closer to the opposite of what everyone had assumed walking past it. The barn people wanted torn down hadn't been rotting the way they thought. It had simply been holding on to a method everybody else around it had forgotten. That winter, Earl set a fresh sack of corn into the restored compartments, then reached into an old tin can where he'd kept a handful of the original kernels he'd found that first day, dried hard as pebbles, decades old. He set a few of them down beside the new grain side by side, the old and the new sharing the same dark space under the floor his grandfather had built. His son, 7 years old that winter, followed him down into the compartment one afternoon and asked why he was keeping corn that old, corn nobody could even eat anymore. Earl thought about it a moment before he answered. "So we don't forget how the good corn stayed good," he said. His son didn't fully understand it, not that year. But Earl figured there'd be time enough for that. The same way, there'd apparently been time enough for his own father to half explain it once and let it sit unexplained for 30 years before Earl ever needed to understand it himself. The farm hadn't been failing because the old ways were useless. It had been failing because nobody left alive still remembered why they'd been built in the first place. If stories about forgotten farms, old buildings, and the quiet systems people once relied on mean something to you, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. Would you have torn down that old barn or knelt down first to find out why corn was growing under the floor?